G'day guys. We're going to look at basically, things like COVID and, the effects of sugar and nitric oxide synthesis and production within the endothelium, and its role and its effects and stuff like that. I mean, in the past, we've heard, the veganarized community basically say, well, if you eat animal foods, it's going to make COVID worse. And, it was all these people eating animal foods that are basically spreading the disease around and stuff like that. It's just, your regular sort of nonsense and all that. First of all, we know that it's a lab job, the recent stuff. So let's just throw that whole nonsense out. But most diseases do not come from domesticated animals. Now, the domesticated animals may be occasionally the vector, but especially for things like flu and colds, but primarily anything new usually comes from the wild. So unless you intend to disassociate yourself, like move to another planet, disassociate yourself with the wildlife of this planet, or kill them all, wasn't that one Vagoon misanthropist that was actually promoting that idea? Let's kill all life on the planet. Then we won't have to worry about anything. Yeah, that was but these are the sort of crazy ideas and notions that people have. The reality is we're part of the natural world, so are many other species, and we exchange different proteins amongst ourselves, whether they're in the form of viruses, whether they're in the form of bacteria, protozoa, fungi, and all sorts of other organisms. The reality is, as long as you're on this planet, you will be at some point, whether you're a Vagoon or whether you're a Carney, it makes no difference. You will be in contact with these different microorganisms. That is reality. So unless you put yourself into a little plastic bubble and be bubble boy and bubble girl. But the rest of us that want to live in the real world are going to be always exposed, susceptible, or whatever. Now, the question is, do we want to be on a species-appropriate diet and have a more robust immune system? Or do we want to, functioning body? Or do we want to basically be on a vagoonerized diet that basically causes massive deficiencies and reduces the robustness of your body to cope with the pathogens in the environment? I mean, we just have to look at the tribal areas in Africa, sun and meat. The difference is in incidences of C19, say no more. Anyway, let me just share my screen and we'll get on with it. Okay, what does the literature say? Might as well look at that. There's a circulation, pretty much associated with you could say the establishment. Okay, the American Heart Association and, the major organizations that we've combated for many years ourselves in the low-carb community. So they're not basically people that are basically going to be promoting an animal-based diet, but they still do some basic research. Some of the people that publish in these, and this is one publication, and this is an oldie back in '97 when there was a bit less issues back then. Circulation did a bit better, did allow some good research on their periodical. High glucose increases nitric oxide synthesis expression. Most people, there is a lot of research in the past that was basically what I call reductionist research. And it basically did a whole lot of research saying, oh, nitric oxide increases with high glucose. That's where they stopped. They didn't look any further. This is important because when you look and do really proper research, and you look at all situations, you realize that okay, there's a bigger story here, much deeper story and meaningful story. But a lot in the academia, the sort of stuff that's done that's funded, let's put it that way, by big pharma, big agri, pretty much pushes the line, oh, high glucose. And then you get the low fat people, the high plant-based types, the vegans, vegetarians. They'll say, look at this, have more glucose and it increases nitric oxide synthesis. And they are correct about that. But there's a deeper story. Yes, it does, but it does other things as well that can be deleterious. It's not enough to produce it. You've got to release it as well and make it available in the system. So there's a fundamental difference here. It's not nuanced. Okay? So in their abstract, they talk about hypoglycemia as a primary cause of premature vascular disease. Endothelial cell dysfunction is characterized by diminished endothelial-dependent relaxation, which is vasodilation, because of NO, nitric oxide synthesis, is likely to be involved. Little is known about the molecular mechanisms of hypoglycemia-induced endothelial dysfunction. This is 97. There was all sorts of research, but it wasn't as good. The method results. This study was designed to determine the effects of hypoglycemia on L-arginine nitric oxide pathway, expressions of endothelial nitric oxide synthesis, eNOS. So when you hear eNOS, it means nitric oxide synthesis. When you hear NO, is nitric oxide itself and the release of it. So yes, you can produce it, but you still have to release it. So yes, we're producing more, but are we releasing more? That's the important part. So the Vagoons will tell you, oh, our diet increases nitric oxide synthesis. That is true. It does. But it doesn't release it. That's the problem. That's the missing part. Why sugar is contraindicated. Anyway, we examined the effects of glucose on nitric oxide release by measuring changes in nitrate and levels of Greer's reaction. Superoxide anions, so O2, superoxide, production, and we know what superoxide is involved. Let's make it quite clear. Production of superoxide is reactive oxygen species. Okay, so keep that in mind and say, oh, yes. And remember, superoxide production inside the mitochondria, the cardiolipin, which is at the end of complex 4. So, okay, in the electron chains. So you can get electron leakage due to high oxidative stress in the mitochondria. It's due to superoxide. Okay, so it's affecting you remember not the matrix, the middle part, but the outer, around the surface, the outer, where the grooves are, on that other side where the proton gradient is actually being built to push through the complex 5 to generate ATP. Well, in that is where you'll get some effects as well, because superoxide will damage cardiolipin, and you'll lose some redox potential. So you'll lose the ability to produce more energy, basically. You'll lose some of the protons out of that inner mitochondrial membrane, as it's called, and you'll also have some leakage out of the electron chain in terms of electrons. This is all due to superoxide, reactive oxygen species, too many of them. So this is what glucose does, especially going through complex 1, it generates massive reactive oxygen species. So just keep that in mind, and this is what we're talking about here, about that sort of stuff. And that has ramifications in the cell, and the cell's ability to function properly, generate sufficient energy and do its job. So that's how it's sort of affecting, without going into the weeds in that regard. So elevated glucose levels increased nitric oxide production by only 40%, but increased the release of superoxide by threefold, which is significant. So all oxidation at the mitochondria produces some reactive oxygen species. It's unavoidable, consuming, and this is where at night, when we're not constantly eating, if we have good sleep patterns and blue blocking and all that, we will have basically the melatonin to heal the mitochondria, okay? And then we can do a bit of producing energy, causes wear and tear in a sense. Let's put it like that. That's probably the best way of actually describing it. It causes wear and tear. So they're talking about an imbalance between nitric oxide. So these results provide a molecular base for understanding how chronic exposure to elevated glucose levels to an imbalance between nitric oxide and superoxide, which may explain impaired endothelial function and be important to diabetic vascular disease. This was back in the past. They were actually noticing this effect. But obviously, there's been more research to look at the mechanisms in a bit deeper level. So this is older research from 97. This is more recent research, Japanese research. And I'm not going to go right through it. Effects of high glucose on nitric oxide production, endothelial nitric oxide synthesis, protein expression in human glomerular endothelial cells. So that's in the kidneys, just for those, the ones that filter the glomerular. So anyway, without going into too much, that's very important because it does clear out stuff and and recover red blood cells and proteins and all that sort of stuff, and gets rid of all the waste products. So they have to be working well. I'm not going to read this because otherwise we don't want to make the purpose of this isn't to, people can read it in their own time. As you can see, this sort of like high glucose on nitrate levels. So it affects the nitrate levels. They go down, As you can see, after 72 hours, you get a big reduction from the control and more glucose. That is a dose dependent and time dependent as well. So up to 72 hours, you're still having this reduction in the capacity to produce nitric oxide. So not a good thing, guys, not a good thing. So I think that was it. Yeah. Oh, that's in the other one. Sorry. This is the part that I actually wanted to show. Nitric oxide synthesis. See, as more glucose, it goes up. And you can see so that was the nitric oxide, and here is the nitrates, which basically indicating we're not releasing nitric oxide. Nitrate levels are dropping. Got it? So indeed, evidence suggests a dysfunction in nitric oxide biosynthesis or bioactivity in diabetes and vascular disease has accumulated. So and this is the sort of while nitric oxide is produced, it's synthesized, it's not being released. This is important. The consequences of that. You've got a decreased NO bioavailability seems to be associated with overproduction of superoxide and L-arginine deficiency. So that's the take-home message. You've got a reduction in L-arginine, and L-arginine produces more nitric oxide. It's required. So what's L-arginine in? I wonder what. Oh, yes, meat. Obviously, meat is the best source for L-arginine. Surprise, surprise, So you've got a decreased nitric oxide availability seems to be associated by those two things, because one, superoxide, which is produced by sugar, is basically reducing the nitric oxide in the system, and it's also depleting L-arginine. So voila. Anyway, glucose scavenging of nitric oxide, endothelial dysfunction, accompanied suboptimal glucose control in patients with diabetes mellitus. They have the worst sort of, obviously, people that are in that sort of situation in that regard. Again, you can actually see changes in NO, in nitric oxide. So you've got the baseline, you've got the challenge, goes down, and the recovery comes back up. Changes in nitric oxide that is get released. We're not talking about synthesis here. We know that glucose actually increases the synthesis of eNOS. But what we want in the endothelium is the release of nitric oxide. Glucose inhibits that because it's generating more superoxide. Got it? Remember the reactive oxygen species I talked about earlier? Okay. So just keep that in mind. Just think, superoxide is increased, and that sort of has an effect on the electron chain of the mitochondria through NADPH oxidase, as it's called. But anyway, we won't get into the biochemistry weeds. So changes in NO, as you can see, there is an increase in the amount of glucose. And as we increase the amount of glucose, we can see a reduction in nitric oxide, dose dependent. Here, again, we see a reduction, and the D type and L type doesn't show much difference. So these are just D glucose and L glucose, so slightly different types. And this is salt, and salt brings the levels above, because there's a lot of nonsense. Like, you'll find a lot of associated stuff that actually in the literature where, a standard diet. If you go to McDonald's, what's a standard diet? It's friggin' full of fructose, glucose. It's a Randall cycle nightmare. Okay. And for palatability, to make it irresistible, they combine fructose fat or seed oil fat and salt. So sodium chloride. So, which is Na for standing for sodium, and L for chloride. So what these people did was plug that in, and voila, different result. So sodium or salt minus the sugar, you get a different result, don't you, boys and girls? Definitely do. So these are important things because in many cases, a lot of these associated studies are misleading deliberately, and then they do fabricated adjustments, and then they say, oh, it's the salt, oh, it's the meat, so all the other stuff doesn't have an effect. Really? But when you actually look at the actual mechanisms, let's just take a look at just the glucose in different types of formulations. What results do we get? They're all negative. You can modify, you can adjust, you can do things with the glucose in a number of different ways, but sugar is sugar. Sorry, Vagoons, but sugar is sugar, and that's not going to change just because you would like it to change. And you can see all these different effects on making different types of playing with different types to see different effects by combining it with different substances to change the, but in the end, and here you've got like an arginine thing with the glucose, sort of a combination. So methyl L-arginine, sort of, sorry, yeah, with that. And you can notice it's not having, but that's because we know that there are other things at play, which we'll explain further down. Again, this is the time thing. Like with the previous stuff that I showed you over time, 72 hours, this is similar things. Just look, you'll get all sorts of strange effects. And then, but the key take-home message is as we increase, the NO goes down, always goes down. And I think that was it in terms of the diagram stuff. I'll attach all this so people can actually look at it and read it themselves. There's always nuancing in everything, but generally speaking, we know that even the glycocalyx can collapse down to 6 hours from glucose. So it has a negative effect. It's because they've got a negative charge. Too much sugar in the system has a positive charge, will tend to sort of stick and collapse those. That's the sort of mechanisms that is believed what is happening and what is being observed. But it's really hard to do those sort of things. We've seen it in rats, and we know that it happens in humans because we've like imaged it. But with the rats ones, we actually put probes in to really see it in detail. But mammals have got the same endothelial. They still produce nitric oxide, all mammals. So it's evolutionary. All mammals have the same arteries, and our diets may be different, our guts and stuff like that may be different, but the production of nitric oxide, the production of vasodilation precursors is very similar. So it's between, it's preserved over evolutionary history. So it's a non-issue. Or in terms of the new evolution, not the Darwinian one, the information preserved over time in that regard. But that's for another conversation, another time, on my view of traditional evolution and the new type of. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that very controversial subject, but for another day. Anyway, Quinine, the tonic for COVID-19, question mark. It turns out the bitter taste in your mouth isn't such a bad thing after all. Exactly. Known as a taste family 2 receptor, bitter taste receptors have become a source of continued revelations. So this just shows the effect on the virus concentration. We'll go to the pretty pictures. And as you can see, quinine actually is interacting. So in the tonic water, remember we were talking about tonic water and zinc, sort of playing a bit of an important role. So quinine can come to these receptor sites, and going through this pathway, there's calcium as well, which plays a role. So calcium can be an important component, especially if you've got those other genes. Remember that other video that I did that discusses the genes with calcium, that you may not be getting enough, blah, 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 on a carnivore diet and why, and all that. You know, that is an important thing for nitric oxide synthesis, enos. So remember that. So if you've got that, you may, even if you're getting on a species appropriate diet, because you've got those genes, you may not be getting enough calcium. And if you're not getting enough calcium, this isn't going to work as well. Okay, so keep that in mind. Everything's important. Last 10,000 years, there have been some adaptations amongst 25% of the population of the ones that I discuss. I'll put that video up there, and I'll put the other one down there, which will cover some other points. Anyway, as you can see, it is anti-COVID and as a direct effect on bacterial, knocks the bacteria out and it knocks the COVID out. So nitric oxide does play a big role, and we've actually noticed that people that have got COVID tend to have much lower nitric oxide levels. If we look back in history, we can actually see that the British Army, moved around the world on tonic water, and their troops were much healthier. They had better robustness to viruses, and now a lot of that wasn't recorded, and it was seen as a British thing. But I think they knew something about it back then. It probably has been lost in time. Some researcher must have come up and realised anecdotally, those troops that are drinking tonic water are not getting sick. So they encouraged tonic water drinking because it seemed to, they didn't know, of course it didn't, but it had this positive effect, on nitric oxide synthesis, but also on, improving its antibacterial and antiviral properties. Back then you had malaria and things like that, which were big killers of troops in the tropics. So just keep that in mind. And so nitric oxide and quinine bitters in the wake of SARS epidemic, elaborate series of investigations appeared from Karolinska Institute in Stockholm to demonstrate that nitric oxide has antiviral effects against envelope viruses, a group that includes both SARS-CoV, which is the original one, and SARS-CoV-2, the lab job. The researchers then showed that they could neutralize the first generation of SARS with high levels of nitric oxide. Voila. We know a species-appropriate diet will increase nitric oxide synthesis and better vasodilation. Your vagunarized sugar may increase the synthesis of it, but the actual release from the endothelium, no. And because you're producing far too much superoxide that depletes nitric oxide, depletes L-arginine, plus collapses the the actual endothelium, it affects it and its dysfunction. And so unless you've got the pericellular matrix with a little having the negative charge, what happens? We can't basically produce nitric oxide. So you initially increase it and then you stuff it up. Well, that's what a sugar-based diet will do to you in the long run. Anyway, so this just covers a bit of that information. There's some research going to be, this is the because this is Pennsylvania Medicine Department of Otorhinolaryngology. Yes, you know my problem with long words. Dyslexic. Anyway. So these asymptomatic carriers are amongst the greatest mysteries of C19 through phenotype have been well described of other viral diseases, including hepatitis, Epstein-Barr, poliomyelitis. Given the uncertainty of transmission in persons who display none of the symptoms of SARS-CoV-2, the various pandemic planning scenarios from the Centre for Disease Control place a percentage of asymptomatic carriers at 40% of COVID-19 cases. Now, the viability of prophylactic beta therapies in SARS-2 is suggested in studies in which, inhibited viral replication impairs viral fusion and entry into the target cell. And that's important because if it goes in there, it starts replicating. Then pre-treated with nitric oxide synthesis, an enzyme that produces NO. The investigation believed that the application of bitter spray will reduce the number of cells infected by SARS-CoV-2 and reduce the amount of shed virus in apical secretions in nitric oxide dependent manner compared to saline treated control. The study is currently enrolling Pennsylvania Medicine. So they've got actually one where they've got, your typical spray, nasal spray, and they've got, and also I'm waiting to see this being published. I'll be interested in seeing the results. And also, because existing research shows quite clearly that nitric oxide is playing a very important role. Now, what they're doing here is they're looking at if you nasally spray, something that will actually increase the nitric oxide production in your sort of the mucosal areas of, the nose and, this sort of area, which most viruses will enter. What happens? Can we reduce replication quite severely and all that? So we know a number of us were using tonic water and we were doing like gargling and stuff like that and whatever. That seemed to really help. It'll be interesting to see what the outcome is in that regard. I suspect it'll be better than the sort of placebo in that regard, but it'll be still interesting to see what happens. Now, some people say, "Oh, Harry, I don't like tonic water." Fair enough. I know some people don't, but we do have other supplements, as we know. Supplements. Citrulline is more efficient than arginine in increasing systemic arginine availability in mice. So we know that when you consume arginine, it does go first to the liver. And so if the body needs it for other purposes, much less will be released into the bloodstream. So you get less nitric oxide. But we know that citrulline goes directly into the bloodstream. And there is the arginine citrulline cycle. So there is a recycling that does happen of citrulline and back into arginine and back again and stuff like that. So I won't go into that whole pathway, but they've actually do demonstrate that citrulline does actually get more nitric oxide, sort of has, it's more available in the actual expression That's in the liver. Hold on, where's the other one? Oh, that's right. The conversion rate, citrulline to arginine. So there's you'll get more, see, in comparison. You get like a nearly, what is it, about 2.5-fold. So 2.5 times in comparison with supplementation levels. So arginine to ornithine without going into the biochemistry of the conversion. And this is the conversion rate. Citrulline will actually bring about a bigger conversion rate. So compared to just arginine on its own. So that's, and we're talking about here, de novo arginine synthesis of citrulline to arginine. Anyway, without going into the weeds and making this video too long, so there's your option. Assessment of nitric oxide potential to mitigate COVID severity. This was some research done back in 2020, just slightly 2024, 2021. Oops, go down. And pretty much they show the sort of mechanisms that are involved in that regard. Yeah, I'll just... Okay. So, definitely, nitric oxide restores endothelial function. This is why it's important. It vasodilates you as well, which means you get a, well, for the men out there that like to be a bit of hanky-panky, it actually firms the fella downstairs as well. We know that. Keep him firm, keep him well, keep him having fun. And then this sort of circulatory movement and mucosal secretion to prevent viral entry. So the mucosal layers need nitric oxide to basically work much better to prevent the viral entry. Another pathway important. Interference with viral entry into host cells, which we discussed earlier, very important. They get in there, they use a machinery in the endoplasmic reticulum, that part which is, the rough part around the nucleus of the cell. They use that, the ribosomes, to replicate. Well, we don't want them going in there to replicate now, do we? Either the virus or the little, you know what. That one, which is actually causing all sorts of problems, increased death rates recently, which we've talked about and we've shown, but we won't go into it in any detail because our dear friends at YouTube are monitoring the airwaves, and you've got to be careful what you say. Extra deaths from, we won't say it. You know what I mean. There's currently in Britain a whole, a government discussion about this, and pointing out, so, and saying, we've noticed significant increases outside the normal range. I wish other countries would, because we are noticing them in Australia and elsewhere, but it seems like our governments are not interested in the excess deaths. I wonder why. Maybe then somebody would have to take responsibility. Maybe then somebody could be prosecuted for doing the wrong thing. But anyway, that's not going to happen anytime soon. Inhibition of viral replication cycle. So it does affect the viral replication cycle. Very important as well. We want to inhibit it. We saw that, there's a direct inhibition of pathogens of bacteria, pathogenic bacteria in the bloodstream and all that. And we know basically a species-appropriate diet will increase nitric oxide. So we know that taurine does it. We know that arginine does it. Well, I wonder what foods primarily have those, amino acids. I can't really work this one out. It's so difficult. Oh yeah, that pesky meat stuff. Oh God. Antithrombotic activity. With all the myocarditis going around, maybe somebody should give them a steak. Just a suggestion. Vasodilatory effect, reducing pulmonary hypertension in the lungs, which is very important to keep them healthy and being able to undertake good gas exchanges. Otherwise, you'll really cark it or have reduced lifespan. Anyway, interesting stuff. This is a more recent one. So they go, nitric oxide, the missing factor of COVID-19. And they sort of cover this. Having successfully developed nutritional formulation interventions based on nitric oxide precursors, authors hypothesize that both the comorbidities associated with negative clinical patient outcomes and symptoms associated with COVID-19 sickness are linked to the depletion of a simple molecule, nitric oxide. And we know that a high sugar diet, and we had the so-called experts telling us, oh, diet's not important. Really? Comorbidities, diabetes, mellitus, and pre-diabetic states and very high sugar levels in the body are not important to inhibit viral replication? I wonder why diabetic people have got far more levels, much higher levels of things like, septicemia and things like that. I wonder why. Could it be that pesky NO stuff that meat releases? Oh, must be devastating for the Vagoons to find that out. A revelation. As I've always said, a steak a day will keep the doctor away. I'm not going to go through this. It just goes in. There's arginine. There you've got superoxide. The different effects, citrulline. They don't go into the cycle. Other people here can look at the electron chain. If I want to see, remember complex 1 produces the biggest amount. Now, through reverse electron transport, you still get some, which isn't a bad thing. But yes, nitric oxide, complex 4. I wonder what actually increases the effects, the up-regulation of complex 4. Oh, that's right. Fat usually primarily increases cytochrome C. Now, also, being out in the sun, outdoors, not being locked up, it does actually increase by 30%. The activity and energy, sort of the functioning of the complex 4, doesn't it? Having a steak out in the sun. Well, we're not allowed to do that anymore. Or, those awful cow burps, have to be stopped. And the moment an outbreak happens, you've got to lock yourself away from the sun. Standard of care nowadays, it's because they're so concerned about you. And we know that the sun also increases nitric oxide production, that sort of effect. God, it's pesky that, it's so inconvenient, these things that are getting in the way of, a good narrative for the experts. It's, just so awful. At least we've got the good people at YouTube and Google looking after the experts. If it wasn't for them, God, people like myself would just run amok. And start showing people research on what happens. There you go. How these things work. Oh, you need calcium. Oh, you need sodium. Oh, God, we can't have that sort of stuff in the diet. Definitely not. God, no. Let alone that other stuff, meat. God, horrendous. How could you do it? Yes, yes. This is what we need. We need more of this. We need more of this. Why aren't you people eating more glucose? Befriend a goon. Yes, I know you people will go, thanks, Harry. Anyway, and these people have no conflict of interest at all. So, no conflict of interest. Should have did it on the classical view. Much easier to go down the classical view. Oh, it was the other one. Sorry. Other one over here. And this study was actually supported by the National Institute of Health grants. So as you can see, most of the stuff that I've looked at have been either funded by government or, by grants or stuff like that. And they've got no conflict of interest. They haven't basically been getting money from industry or big pharma. And that's important because a lot of that research is adjusted or narrow. They're not trying to determine and find out. They're more interested in basically pushing a narrative. And this is the problem. If you go and look at all the vagoonerized research that the vagoons throw up, they go, look at this, look at this. Sugar increases nitric oxide synthesis, enos. It improves vasodilation. We got all that nonsense. Remember the game changer? Same nonsense. That's where that comes from. But that's only telling you half the story. The true story is that glucose causes endothelial dysfunction, and we've known it for a long time. It prevents the release of nitric oxide. You may increase the production of it, but you're also increasing the production of superoxide, which will reduce your arginine, will reduce your NO in your system. And so, whoopee. And also have an inhibitory effect on the insulin signaling, which is another factor. And there's another reason why I always say to people carnivore diet is much better, because it has better signaling in terms of insulin for nitric oxide synthesis, for muscle protein synthesis, and all these sort of things, which is what we need. So it is more indicated compared to a plant-based, which is going to have less of the precursors, less of the things for those sort of purposes. So that's a sort of a take-home message. Now, some people may say, well, I don't like tonic water and stuff like that. Well, this is the reason why I use L-citrulline. Now, when I was doing my experiment and ended up getting C19, COVID, at the time I'd cut out citrulline, taurine, vitamin D, and that was deliberate on my part because I wanted a base level, no supplements, no nothing, just food, and I wanted a base level of an effect to basically then measure my vitamin D levels at after a month. In hindsight, that was a bit foolish on my part. Had I stuck to my regime of taurine, vitamin D, and L-citrulline, I wouldn't have had the problem, because I was multiple times exposed to COVID and people with COVID around me, active COVID, and didn't have a problem. And then when I dropped my guard and removed those substances, and it was winter, and removed those substances, I made myself vulnerable. So I learnt my lesson, but it wasn't, but at the same time, it wasn't severe either. Sort of, I got it. I had one day, a bit of a croaky voice, then a week of a bit of a scratch in the back of my throat, and that was about it. So I'm going, oh, okay. So it wasn't much. Then the flu knocked me out for 2 days. I was bedridden. I'm not kidding you. So, so which is the worst one? I'll let you ponder on that point. I've discussed this before with the British data about, see the severe flu season and all that. But it's probably because we're indoors, not exposed to the irregular cycle of flu, and it mutated quite a lot different than what it was before. And so when we did get it, it was quite different, and the body took a while to basically combat it. And I suspect that was the reason behind it. But yeah, but really the take-home message here is that a species-appropriate diet, which will increase nitric oxide release, not necessarily synthesis, release, and also reduce superoxide, because you upregulate glutathione and superoxide dismutase on a carnivore diet, on a low-carb diet, which mitigates superoxide, which pretty much means you'll get more increase and more vasodilation. Now, in winter, or, as an option, you could consider a bit of citrulline in the sort of flu months, in combination with your vitamin D and your taurine sort of protocol that we've discussed before in other videos. And that could give you an additional benefit of, especially if you're working in the service industry in particular, it's probably beneficial to take midday or early in the morning 2 grams of L-citrulline and 2 grams at midday, just to get a bit more nitric oxide in your system, just to basically put you in a bit of a maximum. I wouldn't go over 8. That's the sort of maximum that most research shows is tolerable. Now, the other thing is, like taurine, it does reduce blood pressure. And because it does reduce blood pressure, if you're on blood pressure medication, you've got to be careful. You need to adjust your meds if you go. My father's blood pressure went up for a period of time, and now that he's doing using these compounds, his blood pressure normalized with. So people can get off their blood pressure meds completely. That's even people that are on a mixed diet. We're not even talking about a carnivore diet here. My father's on a mixed diet. He's not on a carnivore. Yes, he's eating more meat, but he's still on a standard mixed diet. So there's still some randal cycle activation in his life. But still, by administering taurine and L-citrulline, and, choline also reduces, so all these sort of animal things, God, is there nothing they won't do magical? Yes, they do reduced. So when you are supplementing compared to eating, you're going to get stuff into the bloodstream much more rapidly. So you'll have a much more pronounced vasodilation and reduction in basically your blood pressure, and an increase in nitric oxide. So keep that in mind. So if you're recommending it, what I'm saying is to relatives, make sure that those relatives are not on blood pressure meds, and if they are, that they take smaller doses and then adjust their medication, get their medication and they get, before going into higher doses. At 2 grams, not an issue, but once you creep above that, it could be an issue. So we don't want to take risks, guys, with our family members and friends who may be still on a non-species appropriate diet and doing certain things, but we do care for them and we want them to use certain compounds that are found in animal foods to mitigate some of their indiscretions. So, and also provide them with a bit better protection. That's the whole purpose of this video, just to give you a bit more information on how to reduce. Unfortunately, the lab-based job is going to be around for a very long time, and we'll keep on replicating and stuff like that. And if, you know, people like Fauci man, he has his way, he'll create more of gain-of-function varieties to release out there just to make things interesting for the rest of us. So keep that in mind. And so we need to basically protect ourselves and our families using species-appropriate methods and compounds that we can protect ourselves with, because unfortunately, those out there that rule us don't necessarily always have our best interests at heart. Keep that in mind. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this little escapade down the nitric oxide route, and I hope people that are interested in reading the studies find them interesting as well, like I did. Anyway, that's it. See yous.